This is Foxhole, the massive multiplayer online persistent war game where battles rage 24/7 until one side wins. This game puts thousands of players against each other from all across the world in a war that can last over a month, testing not only battlefield tactics, but also the drive to play day in and day out. Whether they're warden or colonial, players must continuously gather raw materials to refine into bombs and tanks, deliver this material to the front line, maintain massive sprawling bases, and slug it out in combat that could see you fighting over a 50-meter stretch of ground for days on end. Everything in Foxhole is created by the players. It's the ultimate war sandbox, but what would happen if the enemy just never showed up? Well, before we get to that, let's give a quick recap of what has happened in Foxhole over the past few months. With the game's official release out of early access in September 2022, there was a massive influx of players. Player-made industrial buildings, trains, enormous tanks, flamethrowers. There was so much new content that even people who hadn't picked up the game in years were ready to jump back in. Before 1.0, wars on average would have a couple thousand players on at any given time at most. So when we looked at the Steam charts and saw that the game was peaking at over 11,000, that was insanity. These crazy numbers require the devs to create multiple wars, or shards, since the servers simply couldn't handle that enormous new player base. Now, when we think of a shard, think of it as simply a copy of the game, a different instance of the war. So the quote-unquote main war, or the one that has been raging back and forth since the game first came out, the one that's full of sweaty vets and enormous regiments, that one would be played on Able Shard. This would be the 96th war between the two factions, and by many is considered the real war. Baker Shard would be open for spillover players, and this was actually a reopening since it had been added to the game temporarily in the past as well in order to handle the issue of overpopulation on big updates. Although this would not be the main shard, it still had a significant community behind it since there had been players who had played in the past that eventually went back to Able when Baker was shut down. Baker would now be on its 25th war. Charlie Shard was also opened, and it was promoted as the ultimate new player shard where devs made sure that people could essentially just have fun and learn Foxhole. For its inaugural war, a base that would normally start with a couple hundred supplies was instead stocked with thousands, since the devs felt that logistics would be extremely hard to handle for new players, and they wanted to make sure that fighting could always take place while people learned how to play the game. So, going into Foxhole 1.0 on September 28th, we had these three shards, Able, Baker, and Charlie, three separate wars that would be fought in a vacuum with a few changes to the map layout in order to create a little bit of variety. If you were a warden on Able, you could go be a colonial on Baker. You could go create a regiment over on Charlie, but if you wanted to be a solo player, you could just join Able or Baker. If a town was lost by the wardens on Able, Charlie wardens could care less. It doesn't affect them. There's no overlap, and every war was their own war.
I feel bad for you.
I don't think about you at all.
The best comparison I could make is if you have ever played any other MMO, but I think World of Warcraft is probably the best. In WoW, realms are simply copies of the game on a different server box, so you can let all the players experience the same game, but separately. This prevents lag, it prevents queues, it just helps people have fun in game. These realms would have all the same content, but the players would essentially decide progression. And in the past, it wasn't uncommon for WoW realms to be fairly behind on things like raid bosses or world events because of the player base's skill level was too low, or if the population wasn't nearly as big. There were also a variety of different rule sets on the realm, such as PvP servers, where Horde and Alliance players could actively fight one another in contested zones as they go about their questing, PvE servers where you didn't have to worry about the enemy team at all, or even role-playing servers, where players could, well, roleplay.
The first personality type is the peaceful one. Now this one is the perfect gnome that is dedicated to his own work.
You serious?
With Foxhole, this separation of wars into three shards was welcome, just like it was welcome with World of Warcraft in order to help alleviate huge queue times. Finally, the veteran regiments can all get on and slug it out for the massive 1.0 in Able, while new players and overflow players can go have fun on the other two Baker and Charlie wars. In order to facilitate this division even more, the devs made it so that Baker's war started first, so many of the new players who weren't in coordinated groups could actually go start playing and potentially relieve the pressure on Able. Baker kicked off and was a good hour or two into their war when Able officially went live. Now, this shard setup was perfect for all of roughly 20 minutes until the players who wanted to just play Able were literally locked out. If you managed to get through the queue on Able, you were good to go, but within the first few minutes, the shard was actually completely closed since it was already deemed full and at capacity. This meant that those large regiments, which typically have extremely elaborate plans and key personnel spread throughout the map to organize things, could potentially be left without their leadership. Those who tried to join once Able was classified as full couldn't even wait in a queue and were instead redirected to Charlie Shard.
Do not log off. Able is not allowing new players to join.
Oh no.
This is your home now. Our regiment, for example, was unable to have any of our logistics officers and personnel log in. Our veteran infantry group was disconnected a minute or two after they loaded in, and we were just left to work with many random players, a lot new, who had actually made it through. Now, this is not an uncommon story. I don't want to focus on what happened to us as some like pity party, but instead I want to use it as an example and explain that regiments from both colonials and wardens throughout the game were essentially decimated and put at a handicap within the first few minutes of the war throughout some sort of dev-led inadvertent Thanos snapping.
You should have logged in earlier.
Many people couldn't have joined the group that they had spent upwards of 1, 2, or even 4 years playing with and had now spent over a month preparing for, and instead were given the option to play on Charlie or just not to play. So many chose to wait it out since once again, Able has been seen as the real war. As the day went on and with all three wars raging, another issue began to pop up, and this one is one that has plagued Foxhole for years no matter the population. Each region in Foxhole is actually its own separate server, so the shard and playable world is actually made up of 39 individual servers, which include 37 in-game regions called hexes and 2 home regions, 1 for each faction. Each one of these hexes can hold roughly 200 players, or 100 of each faction, and the game has a system that ensures one side can't have too high of a player advantage on the other in order to keep the fighting relatively balanced. For example, a frontline hex that has 100 players on both sides will obviously create a queue for either faction when they try to enter it, since the server is at capacity. However, a hex which has, let's say, 40 wardens in it and 80 colonials will now create a queue just for the colonials in order to prevent a complete stomp. This is a very simplified explanation of this, and to be honest, the queue mechanic is an extremely controversial system in the community, but just understand that this is how Foxhole queues work. Now, obviously, when you have 37 playable regions, not every one of those is going to be an active front line. The war started on Able like this, meaning that most of the fighting would be split between the contested 11 hexes, but that would actually even be less since a number of these hexes are well known as stalemate hexes due to bridges, which early war technology makes it close to impossible to attack over. So in reality, we had roughly 5 main front lines, which in total could only hold around 1,000 players, 500 from each side. The rest of the estimated 6,000 to 7,000 players would now have to spill over onto the less attractive front lines, the midline regions, and the backline logistics towns if they wanted to play the Able War.
I offer you a
Bridge fight.
in this trying time.
The massive population was a double-edged sword, with intense frontline fighting erupting all over the map, but places which didn't normally have queues now had them, such as backline logistics towns. Players who were trying to deliver critical materials to the fronts were now met with queues nearly everywhere they went, since those who couldn't get into the main fighting were instead deciding to check out the new player-made industry mechanics and began building their very own facilities anywhere they could.
Logi is just, they're now getting situated fully because they keep getting kicked out, and then the queue in Clan's Head.
Our Logi is way back here. It's not that bad of a Logi route, but our logistics, whenever they swap regions, they're getting disconnected because of the server issues. Whenever you get disconnected, you don't save your spot. You lose your spot in queue, and you get all the way to the back of the line. So we're losing trucks full of raw material. We're losing trucks full of finished goods, and then we're losing the guys who were like assigned to do it. With queues all over the place, the devs had to implement a new method of trying to play Foxhole. Soon after war start, whenever you tried to press play, you were now given an option: wait in queue or play now. Although a few dedicated players might wait in queue for their regiment, most people who were joining Foxhole wanted to simply play, so they would press the play now button and would now get redirected to Charlie Shard. Most wouldn't even realize they were in Charlie Shard, and since a lot of the media and content about Foxhole says it's one large persistent war game, thought they were actually playing the same game everybody else was. Now, although Baker's shard was technically the second shard, and ironically, it was actually the first war to start in 1.0, new players were now being funneled into Charlie, since most would miss the small shard selection on the top right of your screen where you could pick which war you wanted to play in. If I'm being honest, this was needed. I think everybody agrees that 3 shards at 1.0 was good for the community, since those who were experienced enough to select the shards and either wait in Able queues or join their friends on Baker did so. And the couple thousand new players who would filter through the game would end up on the extremely forgiving and new player friendly Charlie shard. It was a win-win-win.
The important difference here is with win-win-win, we all win.
Well, as the wars went on, we eventually had to have a winner. Foxhole 1.0 resulted in some of the longest wars in Foxhole history, with Able and Charlie lasting around 35 days, while Baker took over 40. Foxhole is a game of morale, and after a month of daily playing, with some people logging double-digit hours in-game multiple times a week, players were exhausted, doubly so if your side lost. Able was won by the Colonials, while Baker and Charlie were won by Wardens. After long wars, it is extremely common for a side to take a much more relaxed approach to the game. This can be seen both after winning and after losing, as many Warden regiments took a massive step back after winning War 83, resulting in a 3-war losing streak, while Colonials would win a blitz of a war in 88, followed by 3 straight defeats as well. It's a pendulum, and players will play when they're having fun. And despite the fact that you can have fun while losing, let's be honest, we all like to win, but Foxhole is addictive, and you become invested in the game. You become invested in your faction, and especially you become invested with those that you play with. So more often than not, players will continue to log in and war out, and usually at least try to put up a good fight. I know I'm not alone in having extremely fond memories of all-nighters desperately trying to defend a town against a force we had no business winning against, only to finally go to bed and wake up a few hours later and see that it had fallen when I went to sleep. Even in those moments, you think of the fun you had the night before, and in those moments, that's what makes Foxhole worth it. This all changed, however, after 1.0. With the implementation of 3 shards, what has now begun to happen is the evolution of faction-specific wars. In the past, if your faction lost, there was nowhere else to play Foxhole. As mad as you were, as salty as you were, you would ultimately have to log in and play the next war, no matter the odds, if you wanted to get your Foxhole fix in.
Thanks a lot. You, and I'll see you tomorrow, idiot.
Well, for various different reasons, a number of Warden regiments that would typically play on the quote-unquote main war on Able have moved. As a result, Able shard has turned into a colonial-dominated shard, with War 97 ending a nearly complete rout of the Wardens in just over 2 weeks, and War 98 looks to be going the same way, only 1 week in. Charlie shard, which remember was automatically funneling players into it since 1.0, is now looking to be a Warden-dominated shard after they are now undefeated since it was released. Baker, on the other hand, despite the Wardens winning the 1.0 war, is now a ghost town, with large coordinated regiments playing on either Able or Charlie. Both Wardens and Colonials on Baker find themselves without the necessary population needed to have basic firefights. The hype from Foxhole's release has died down, and the game's current 24-hour peak is just over 2,000 players, which was an arguably healthy number of players when the game only had 1 shard, but divided over 3 has made it really unplayable. With 2,000 players now split between the 3 different wars, Colonials who want to win and coordinate with other Colonials have trended to Able. Wardens who want to win and coordinate with other Wardens have trended towards Charlie, and Baker is simply a ghost town that people on both sides don't really see the value in defending and fighting over. To see just how bad it was for myself, I actually logged on to Baker as a Colonial and deployed to a victory point town. A victory point is needed to win the game, and each hex has 1 victory point. Get 32 of them and your faction wins. These towns are seen as high priority for both sides and is typically defended by massive bases. They're typically extremely well stocked, and any sniff of an enemy nearby will essentially cause a wave of friendlies to swarm in and fight them off. In Baker, well, the first person I actually ran into was an enemy player just running around the town hall by himself. I even tried to talk to him in local chat. I said I was friendly, and he just ran off without shooting me to do whatever he was doing. The town and nearby area had basically no supplies, there were no defenses, and nobody cared. I eventually typed in world chat to try and find someone who wanted to actually play Foxhole, and a few wholesome moments later, we were in another completely empty hex, squatted up and rearing to go. Unfortunately, what was painfully obvious from the get-go was not only were there no players to have firefights with, but there was actually nobody maintaining any of the bases either. Giant concrete bunkers had decayed and disappeared since nobody was caring about the upkeep. There were no weapons or ammo anywhere since no logistic players were in the back line playing, getting raw materials, and putting things into the factory to deliver to the front. And one or two actual front lines had any sort of activity. Additionally, much of the map was actually white, meaning that neither team had decided to secure it. Towns and relic bases were empty, and both sides understood that it simply wasn't worth the time to invest in the supplies needed to not just build it back up, but to hold on to it, since they wouldn't have the personnel to defend it later on, and one person could simply wipe out hours and hours of progress. I thought it'd be interesting to see just how far two players could go in a war where nobody was playing. And after scouring the map for supplies, we managed to find some explosives to blow up 2 towns in Faranet Coast, meaning that the wardens had now officially been kicked out of the hex by only 2 people. We then traveled back after our victory to a logistics town, picked up 2 large siege tanks, and then drove them into the neighboring hex of Lynn of Mercy, where we then destroyed 2 more bases. And then, and only then, did we finally begin to see some actual resistance. Within the next hour, both sides managed to just barely scrape together 5 or so players, and a little bit of a firefight broke out. A small glimmer of what Foxhole is supposed to be, but both sides really didn't have the resources to do anything other than just harass one another. I knew that going into this, it was just going to be ridiculously boring, and if I had never played Foxhole before, it was just that. A giant, massive multiplayer online game with a persistent war that's supposed to be raging 24/7, and only 1 or 2 people are playing in 2 different hexes? Something is horribly, horribly wrong. To put what we did into perspective, in just a couple hours, the 2 of us were able to clear out roughly 2,000 meters of ground. We destroyed 4 enemy bases and began threatening a victory point town. And we were actually only stopped when 5 people decided to show up. On Able, literally a day before our shenanigans on Baker, in order to break through roughly 150 meters of ground, we needed dozens and dozens of players, tons of different equipment, hundreds of artillery shells, and a constant flow of supplies to secure just 1 base. And even that took 2 to 3 hours. The next day, the enemy even staged an invasion on our victory point town, and what would normally be a huge rallying cry for defenders ended up being a fairly futile attempt to fight the Colonials back, as their overwhelming numbers and supplies rolled through what few wardens showed up. By trying to support a massive player base, Foxhole is inadvertently shooting itself in the foot, and I'm beginning to see a lot of parallels to World of Warcraft. Just like Foxhole, WoW has 2 factions, Horde and Alliance, and although player versus player combat is not at the forefront of the game like it is in Foxhole, it can still happen while players are simply running around trying to do quests, level up, and raid. And unsurprisingly, the more populated faction would begin to overwhelm questing areas, literally killing off the underpopulated one. As time went on, the lower populated faction would simply move servers, making it even harder for those who stayed and wanted to complete content, since they no longer had people on their own faction to play with. This domino effect has turned many WoW servers into faction-specific realms, and it's not uncommon for most servers to be 99% Horde or 99% Alliance, with true 50-50 split realms few and far between, meaning that the lower populated faction has to either move if they want to play the game, or simply stop playing altogether. While World of Warcraft can survive if 99% of the server is one faction, since World PvP is just a small part of the game, Foxhole has a significantly lower player base than WoW, and unlike WoW, it's completely reliant on PvP. So if you give a small player base the option to no longer grit their teeth and try to fight through a loss, and instead offer them the ability to move over to a war that allows them to always have fun and always be on the offensive, players will always go to the path of least resistance. And because of this, the essence of Foxhole's persistent world war is slowly dying off.
Some are saying that you're bipolar.
Wow, what does that mean? I'm bi-winning.
These shards no longer feel like Foxhole. Able feels a little bit more like Colonial Foxhole, Charlie feels a little bit more like Warden Foxhole, and Baker feels like a complete afterthought. Even if Able and Charlie aren't the absolute ghost towns that Baker currently is, these are not healthy wars. Players on both sides will admit that it's not fun to play against a side that's simply not playing, since you are just blowing up bases with little to no resistance. The best moments in Foxhole are not PvE, or blowing up enemy bases without any resistance. The best moments are the desperate last stands, the crazy invasions, and the all-out tank battles against players of the enemy team. And both the winners and losers from these fights typically will say that they have fond memories of their experiences, since it is so unique to the game of Foxhole. Foxhole. No other MMO that I've played can give what Foxhole can give, but that requires both factions to show up. Just yesterday, the devs announced that Charlie would have another war, much to the surprise of everyone in the community. Although big updates may bring players in the future, the current player base cannot simply support 3 separate wars, and Able will continue to be colonial dominated while Charlie will be warden, leaving Baker limping along as some zombie apocalypse simulator. Due to the nature of Foxhole and the attachment many get after investing so many days and hours played in a region, fighting with people day in and day out, and making very real friendships, the community is now beginning to split over hardliners who are evaluating their shard over the state of the game, stating that they would rather the game fail instead of consolidating the player base into one war. There are wardens on Charlie saying that they would never play with wardens on Able. It's essentially a group of children stomping their feet and crying, saying that they will only play their game with their favorite ball, and if it's not their ball, they're going home and not playing the game, despite the other ball being the exact same thing, playing the exact same basketball game. Foxhole is one of, if not the best games I have ever played. In a year, I have already spent over 2,000 hours playing it, and it's everything I've ever wanted in an MMO. But that game isn't the game that I'm playing right now. I'm not making this video because I dislike Foxhole. Instead, I'm making it because I love it and I want it to succeed, and the shell of the game that I'm playing at the moment is a far cry from what it can be. New players logging into Baker would most likely refund the game after exploring empty front lines and dying to a pillbox, while wardens on Able and colonials on Charlie will continue fighting in a war that they simply don't have the population to win. It's a sad state that I'd argue can only be remedied if the servers are merged, and any experienced player will tell you that waiting in a queue for an extremely active and exciting war is far and away a much better experience than fighting an enemy that never shows up. In saying that, even winning won't keep people interested in playing the game if there's no challenge, meaning that not only the losers have started to leave Foxhole, but the winners have too. Call it Able, call it Baker, call it Charlie, hell, I don't even care if it's named X-Ray or Gilgamesh, but bring back a unified community under one war and one shard, and I truly believe that the game will continue to flourish and grow to a state where eventually we can have multiple wars again. But what do you guys think? Are you a Foxhole veteran or new player that might feel the same way? Have you been wandering the front lines, wondering where the magic of Foxhole is? Or maybe you're one of the shard hardliners that would rather kill the game you know and love instead of playing a war on a server under a different name. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below, and if you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. But that's it for me. Until next time, peace.